So it's about 5 minutes after. So if anyone's joining in, they'll join in. So how's everyone doing today?
Good. Hanging in there.
Alrighty. So I wrote in the general chat that today we'll be discussing freedoms, and on top of freedoms, we'll be discussing philosophy to politics and how philosophy roots politics, and of course, historical analysis. Because freedom itself is not just some notion that we have, that we should just appropriate as such when thrown in our perception. Freedom must be understood, just like as all things should be. It should be understood in not just a material perspective, but a historical perspective as well. So, to begin our freedom discussion, we're going to go back to the long 18th century, the Enlightenment period of white European thought, because that is where our modern notion of freedom comes from. And if you caught that white European nonsense, you'll know that anything white European is also inherently colonialistic from their actions that we've seen across history. So, this idea and notion of freedom comes from our Voltaire's, Descartes, comes from our Rousseau's, our philosophers of those time periods. And it is important to understand how these individuals thought in their material conditions, in their schemes of life, in that 16th, 17th, and 18th century of living, and understanding how these people lived in their white conditions to have procured those white thoughts. And so all of our freedoms and establishments, especially here in the imperial core in America, are founded upon these long 18th century thoughts. So the idea of freedom, individualism, skepticism, and all of our thoughts and ideas come from this idealism. And so the philosophers of that time period did not have an understanding or grasp of materialism, which was what later developed more so, right? It wasn't established and created, but founded and discovered by, of course, Karl Marx, Engels, Hegel, the 19th century philosophers that we accredit dialectical materialism to. And so that exists as a tool to combat ideal thinking and how one naturally just appropriates during the Enlightenment period thinking. So we go back to freedom. So, what is freedom? And is freedom just something that we do and have? So, to understand freedom, there must be something else to contrast that freedom against. It's not something inherent. It's not something that we just have. Like freedom of speech, it was given, but that gave in that process of giving that freedom had to have come from somewhere. And so you have the non freedoms of speech, right? The non freedoms of assembly, like the conditions and situations that allow for that non freedom. And of course, here in America, in our point right now, we can imagine those freedoms stripped away in the conditions of prison and jail, in our confinement periods, and those sets of conditions. And so you have existences of these non freedoms, which is why you have freedoms, right? We don't have the freedom to breathe air. There then would constitute a condition of non breathing free air, right? You would either have to pay for or in some way acquire some compensation to acquire this air. No, we have all of this air. It's not free because there's no condition at which allows this not to be free. So this is why in our Constitution we don't see the freedom to breathe air. We do have the freedom to speech, which means there exist conditions at which there are no freedom to speak and speech and press and right to bear arms and vote, right? And all of our amendments and freedoms exist as a thesis to the antithesis of the conditions of its non-freedoms, of its I guess it's a counteracting statement and its freedom. So freedom of speech, no freedom of speech. We would see those conditions in jail or in a prison where you don't have those freedoms, right? Where you are confined to a set of conditions that strips you away from freedoms. And notice how in the Constitution language, slavery is prohibited if you are being punished for a crime. And so that punishment of crime allows for those non freedoms, which is why we say we have freedoms. Because there exist conditions that don't, right? When we talk about air, it's not free air, it's just air. But when we talk about speech, it is free speech. Because there exists conditions where you don't have it. And that not having stuff also goes into that notion of ownership. But freedom and ownership are adjacent and akin to the same idea. But we're going to keep talking about freedoms and why I particularly don't like the notion of freedoms. Like, I like the idea of freedoms. People should have all the freedoms in the world. But continuing to have such freedoms, you're always going to therefore exist and perpetuate that existence of non-freedoms. So in order to truly have a free society, we have to do away with this concept and notion of freedom. So just like how the Black Panthers say, after the abolishment of capitalism, private property, imperialism, and all of these things that are antithesis to communism, so therefore goes the Black Panther Party. And so there will go this general strike organization of, well, we will not need to strike for anything if there's nothing to strike against. We will disband this organization, right, if it happens in our lifetime. No more general strike because there's nothing to strike against. Same thing with the freedoms. The air is free. Well, it's not really free. It just is. And that is being, that fundamental being, is what we strive for when we talk about our freedoms of speech. Speech should just be. We should just be able to talk, right? But then we also have this quote unquote inherentness of good and bad. But back to freedoms, right? Our right to bear arms and such. We have to have these things, have to have it being said for it to become apparent to us. So most of this conversation will be rooted in philosophy because our philosophy builds our politics. So when it comes to freedom, freedom must be understood from a philosophical standpoint. What is to be free? How is freedom? What can freedom look like? And how does one attain a freedom? Because when you're talking about the Rousseau days and the well old 1600, 17, 1800 philosophers, right, within their material conditions, within their schemes of life, you have to understand that these people lived under a king and queen. These people lived under a monarchical rule. And so an absolute rule of an individual with supposed divine power they questioned. In no difference than ways do we question our material conditions, but instead they question their material conditions through a lens of idealism. It is through a lens of which in a man that thinks, right, capital M, man, the being that thinks, understands his material conditions to be appropriative, to be something that the individual must come to grasp with, not there to appreciate and observe, which is where dialectical materialism comes in and makes apparent and sheds that sort of light on it. But these men, capital M, back in the day, the being that thinks, right, way back when in the 18th century, these individuals lived under the king and queen. And these kings and queen had this presence and this establishment, sort of no different than what we have now with our presidents and prime ministers. But we do have elected offices for these positions. However, the position still stands. No matter who the individual fills in that role, it just so happened that kings and queens do it for their lifetimes, and presidents and prime ministers do it only for like less than a decade, right? Or, more than a decade, or whatever. A time span and period that is more digestible to the individual perception, but it is the position that still exists of this authoritative power that constitutes their kind of monarchical kinship. So even though they don't have absolute power and control, it is still a position at which constitutes power and control, right? The top cop in America is the president, and the cop, of course, has authority. And so what makes him, or her, right, different than a king or queen? He'll talk about these checks and balances. The philosophers leading up to the American Revolution and as building the Constitution, there was these checks and these balances because as much as we badmouth and not credit out of our philosophers, they did think and they do think and they thought pretty profoundly. But these individuals thought of that checks and balances to be the end all be all. Just like how the mode of production of capitalism, some people think that to be the end all be all when it comes to production. Checks and balances exist to combat such man-made existing conditions, like the notion of inherent good and evil. So therefore must be laws of the land, police to enforce these goods to combat the evil. But when the individual lives their scheme of life with this inherency of good and evil, the individual leaves no question to the existences that live outside of their perception. There always must be a bucket of good and evil. And so our philosophy from those days, right, take that, and especially when you combine it with religion and Christian nationalism, our philosophy, right now as our neoliberal American society, our philosophy is pretty morally on an axis, on a moral axiom, I guess you would say, which takes away from the true freedoms that people would then be able to have. Because if the individual exists on a moral axiom, then the individual exists aligning with particular freedoms. And those particular freedoms, in their notion, would constitute various livings of schemes and conditions of existing and being. And so when you have those particular existing and conditions of being, of course, by preference, you have to establish those freedoms for that people. So remember when we said, what is a freedom? How is a freedom to be? There always must be a contrasting effort against when you're talking about a freedom, right? Freedom of speech, no freedom of speech. So we also talked about who is that freedom for. And so in our, as I said, white nation, in our white Christian nationalist nation, our freedoms, of course, go to the white Christian national, which over the course of time has grown its audience to just the white national. And so it is the white national who is supposed to have all of these freedoms in the society, not the black national, not the quote unquote red national, not the indigenous, right? Anyone else of that background, of the non whites, do not have such freedoms, even though in our Constitution it says all men are created equal, lowercase m. It would still, of course, just be men. But of course, remember who was property or considered property back then when they created the Constitution. So, what is freedom truly in our Constitution or in the American Constitution? What is freedom for the white man? Now it is the capital owning white man, right? Kamala Harris is just a white man in a person of color's body. I'm not going to say that she isn't all this evil person or this good person, but it's very apparent that our politicians are all white men because they all push this white narrative. So freedoms come from this white notion. And so you can't have black freedom in a white land. You can't have any sort of freedoms in a white land because there exists an inherent whiteness to this freedom. And so this is where the philosophy and to politics come in. Our philosophy is inherently white and there's no escaping it. Our laws, our rules, our liberal society is of a specific condition, and that specific condition is whiteness. Now, I use whiteness as a derogatory term, right? You can be white, but then still be left leaning, because the term white being used here is to note a appropriative nature to the being of whiteness, right? I'm specifically talking about the colonial settler. I'm specifically talking about the individual who voted for Trump and believes that the fascist regime of the Trump presidency would fix the society or the world, I guess. That is who I'm talking about when I say the whites, right? Because there exists, of course, white people. Michael Parenti, himself a white person, very Marxist. Karl Marx, a white person. So when we say white people, we of course mean the appropriative, colonialistic individual who it takes their philosophy under a white theme. So it's very black and white that we understand these philosophies from. But when we talk about from philosophy to politics, it is our philosophy and our organized way of thinking that creates our politics. There would be no such politics if there was no such philosophy to ground our ways of thinking. Because our politics is just the organization of society, and society are made up of individuals. And individuals, of course, take upon a philosophy or they take upon a scheme of thinking, how the individual perceives their material conditions, in which that projection is then made into a politic. How someone engages themselves into a politic, you'll understand how they engage into a philosophy. And so we're going to go into a little personal story I had over the weekend that, motivated this conversation, this freedom talk. So I was at a cousin's birthday party this past Saturday, and so we were chopping it up. I brought some zines, had some zines around, whatnot. Have some activists in my family. I have some intense, hardcore Trump supporters in my family. So I got a little bit of everything. And so, as the youngins of the family, because I'm in my early 20s and all my cousins are, fairly young as well, I try to, of course, radicalize my peers because, power in numbers. We need every way we can get. But I came upon a roadblock, and my cousin is one of those roadblocks. He's a very stubborn person. So, as I was talking to this individual, my cousin, they were listening. I think they were grasping what I was talking about, but I was met with a lot of resistance when it came to burning down the system, right? Because I'm very anti-establishment. But as I was talking of my left-leaning politics, I was always greeted with, I got to do it all by myself, or Jaden, this is all just fun talk, but I got to go to work tomorrow. And I was like, well, yeah, trying to open your third eye to it. So we were having a conversation and talking, and I noticed very heavily the individual scheme of life. I notice heavily the reliance on corporation, even though that he knows that corporations are bad. There is an inherent reliance that we must have with the system in order for our schemes of life, our reality, and this society to perpetuate. And it was very humbling to talk to not just a family member, but who I considered a brother, my cousin, because I haven't talked to this person, in a while about this kind of philosophy. And so it was really like just a shocker. It was a eye opener for me to understand that individual schemes of life are made by the material conditions because he works day in and day out a lot of hours, like 40 to 60 hours, I would say normal nowadays, but he can't escape that scheme of work. Therefore, he as the individual cannot understand the presented conditions that I was trying to, well, present to him, because within his scheme, what does he do? He works, gets a paycheck, and does what he can do, does what he wants to do in his free time. So, where does that leave any class consciousness? Where does that leave any scheme of skepticism? And so, where does that leave him when it comes to building that revolutionary mindset? There is no space. There is no space for him to make upon that action, right? Of wanting to strike, wanting to revolt, wanting to better understand his material conditions. One, because the individual living under capitalism and as a job has believed that the problems of production have been solved. The individual in production must work in this so called meritocracy to have materialized or attempt to materialize a desired life. So it is truly the hyper individualism of the system that creates these types of individuals. The individual who doesn't believe that a revolution is possible, the individual that doesn't believe that these ideas of socialism and communism are anything to be taken but more than a grain of salt. So it was a really humbling experience. I really opened my eye to try and um, maneuver my methods around, try different ways of trying to instill class consciousness, because I've had multiple conversations with him in the past. But this past time really showed the capitalist mode of thought. The I need to do this myself. The I have a car to pay off. He has a car to pay off. The I have rent to pay. I have to do this all by myself. And so it was hyper individualism that really spoke out to me when talking to my cousin. And so I was only talking philosophy as well, right? It was a little bit of politics, but it was more so like common sense. Like, why is the billionaire getting paid billions and then, homeless person homeless? But it was more philosophical because our philosophy creates our politics. And I noticed that within his philosophy, my cousin's philosophy, that it was hard for him to grasp the idea of communalism or communism, the idea that people aren't inherently good or bad. It is the material conditions that make the individual. It wasn't something that they were really grasping, because within his scheme, of course, in the reality that his perspective materializes in, there is no such community at which comes present. There is no such community beyond the family, right? The coalition of his individuals that makes that notion apparent, right? Besides me as a source, everyone else in his life, his job, the structures, of course, and the system that he so hates, all contributes to the thought that it must be the individual that must, take upon the mantle of growth, development in a society. It is the society that is the problem, not the individual. And so, of course, we have here in our socialist and communist space, no, it is the society or the structure, at least, that presents the problem. The individual themselves, right, a product of material conditions, can change under the material conditions. My cousin didn't think so. It was the person who, born inherent, man, capital M, the being that thinks, that is inherent. Therefore, his material conditions forever changeable. Of course, as we talked about, it is meant to be appropriated, our material conditions, to change the landscape and change the people. And to a sense, that's true. Our material conditions do change people, and the change of people come from our material conditions, and the people who make that change are often accredited to that change. So I'm sure if you notice that in our sciences and our um, material conditions, our being, our schemes, we name stuff after people, specifically white people. We name our sign. Newton's law of gravity, white man. Um, some proton or Heisenberg's thing in physics. There's a lot of white Darwinism as well, white phenomena that are attributed to the discoverer. But if you try to do that with any brown folk, or if you do that with any non-white person, you will just come up with the like equation's name, or you'll come up with the phenomena's name. So we live very heavily in a white, right, capital W nation, and in an international as well. So when we talk about philosophy and talk about politics and talk about what freedom is, we have to understand where they come from. We have to talk about, let's see, oh yeah, Huey P. Newton. That's my guy right there. So yeah, we never talk about how revolutionary intercommunalism comes from our boy, Huey P. Newton. We just always talk about just the concept, right? Revolutionary intercommunalism. We don't talk about who created it. Now, if a white man were to not create, like discover this notion of revolutionary intercommunalism, we wouldn't call it that. We would call it whatever that white guy name was, and then attribute him with the discovery. Just like Christopher Columbus is attributed to discovering America. Oh my God, that white guy discovered and sailed all the way from Spain. Of course, as we know, that's not true at all. He didn't discover shit. He just stumbled upon a land and started doing his white colonial appropriativeness, and then over the course of centuries, whitewashed history. And then now in our schools, we teach that Columbus was just a guy. He was just a guy that discovered some things, and then we have Thanksgiving because of him. Thanks. So we understand through our history, and we're going to go right into historical analysis from this. We understand through our history the trueness, or as Hegel would say, a truer form of the world. Because nothing from within the perception is inherently true. Nothing out of perception, right, from the individual perspective is inherently true. There must be a collection of perspectives of some sort to have that trueness. And it is the history, what has been materialized already for our observation, that creates that trueness. So we'll talk about gravity for a second, like Newton. That guy, he discovered gravity. Well, he just found out a way to mark it, just to identify it, and gravity. And so before there was the discovery or so of gravity, gravity still existed, and it is still here. Just like how we do not contribute Karl Marx to creating communism. Communism was already here with the existence of capitalism. There just needed to be some sort of analysis and articulation of that analysis for it to become present within our perspective and our schemes of life. So nothing truly is created. Through historical analysis, we understand that things are discovered. So no one discovered fire when man, lowercase m, discovered fire. We just happen to have organized the material conditions in such ways, using our perspective and using our ways and beings and meanings of our caveman days to procure such fire. Fire was not invented or created. It was discovered, just like how most and all of our technologies are created. AI is discovered. Everything is discovered, not created. So AI, of course, has been discovered through the rearranging of material conditions and the exertions of the individual to discover such arrangement within perception. So it is the articulation of that perspective that creates that finding. So like gravity, Newton just had articulated his perspective through understanding what gravity is, or his sciences, right? His calculus and his physics and all of his mathematics and such. We understand that things are discovered, and it is historical analysis that helps us discover, because humans are naturally people, storyboard thinking individuals. We like to think in stories. We like to think from a beginning, middle, and end. And history, quite so conveniently, offers such beginning, middle, and end. Right, the beginning, the point of the story that we talked about, the middle, the good, juicy, chunky parts of the story that we mean to get to, and then the end, right? When we're talking about history from long ago, the end is usually a nice wrap to a entire value that is then consumed, or that is then understood by the individual listeners. Maybe it is understood by the professor, or maybe it's the individual that just happens to hear. But we understand things in the beginning, middle, and end. So, of course, we started this conversation and this discussion at the beginning about half an hour ago. And then we are just right in the thick of it, the chunk, the nice meaty stuff, right? The stuff that is the reason why people are here to listen to, understand political thought, and understand our material conditions. And then, of course, we will get to an ending. And that ending will then present us a nice, complete concept that we can go ahead and refer back to. So in the near future, we could be like, hey, remember that political discussion last week? And then, yeah, we can just go ahead and talk about the entire notion. Because inherently, one of the things we do inherently is talk about things from a historical standpoint. But we don't talk about it like, oh, I'm going to historically analyze our, meeting last time. No, we talk about this naturally in our conversations, the way that communication has been naturalized. Hey, remember that X, Y, and Z blank? Or, oh, remember we used to do that X, Y, and Z? We are referring to conditions that existed in the past within perception in hopes to rematerialize their experience for ourselves in the present moment or in the near future. So everything lives in a beginning, middle, and end. So we'll do this with birth, and we'll bring back philosophy into this. Our philosophy begins with birth, with our beginnings. Right? You could talk about man, the capital M being that things, or you could talk about you, yourself, the individual, right, living in your life. Birth. It all begins at birth, where we begin our perception, where we begin our life, and we begin our philosophy. So birth has this intrinsic being, this super mystery to it. Why are we born? Why are we here? We start asking these questions. And then we get into the thick, meaty, juicy part of it, and we call that life. And life itself is so full of so many things, it's just impossible to get all of it all in at once. But you experience what you can, and then finally you die. There comes death, your ending part to the experience of life, that which allow for a nice concept to finally formulate. Because when we always ask, what is the meaning of life? In order to understand a full concept as, a full meaning and being, it must be a complete thought, right? There is no such incomplete thought that provides a profound value for consumption or profound value for discussion, right? There exists a complete thought for that consumption or for that talk. And so life in the same way. We could cut the conversation short right now at 4:30, but then you could say it was an incomplete thought from the projected, 1 hour, but it is still a complete thought once this ends, because then you can describe and articulate its existence, having no longer an experience, being perpetuated. This call, right? This discussion being perpetuated. The end of this discussion would note a particular existence. At the end of this discussion would note a particular value for consumption. So in our historical analysis, we understand that things begin, middle, and end, just like our talk about freedom, that had a beginning, middle, and then we might talk about it in the end. Our philosophy to politics all have a beginning, middle, and end. Where does it begin? Where does it, where's the juicy, good bit parts? And then where is the end of all of it? You're always asking our questions. Well, we forget to analyze our conditions. And of course, the historical analysis brings out those answers, right? Why does gravity do the thing that it does? Well, someone already did that for us. The guy's called Newton and other brilliant physicists to help us articulate and understand our material conditions. Why do we have to revolt, revolutionize, strike, and organize? Well, you see it in both in our material conditions when it comes to capitalism and all of the functions that happen within the private ownership of that capital. And then you understand it through the revolutionary or the combative side, the intercommunal side, where it's like people and community are the answer, not private industry and hyper individualism, the rights and the freedoms of the white man. As we see, it just so happens to pan out better in our material conditions when we start to implement those community ideas, when we start to implement those ideas and materialize those actions that help the human individual. So, in our historical analysis, it's very important to understand. We understand that it is not just freedoms that we should be concerned about. Like in America, we're always concerned about our freedoms, and not just about our politics that we should be concerned about, because our politics will run the American government. It is everything that is to be considered through historical analysis, and no matter what it be. So we understand our conditions through this historical analysis. We understand our philosophies, our conversations that we have with our peers. We understand how the world comes to be when we have our historical analysis. And we do it all the time. We don't just call it historical analysis, of course, as I said, but it is helpful to understand where this particular notion exists as a solid idea, as a solid object to point to. Like, what are we referring to? Historical analysis. Most people just don't have this thought when they have this profound thinking, and it is profound thinking when you think historically and analyze your material conditions in such ways, because it helps you uncover a more truer, as Hegel says, a truer world. So you understand your past to create the present, right? To then project into the future. So our past is solidified material labor, solidified material thought. And so we analyze what has been, and we understand what has been done. And so from that analysis, we can then pretty much guess what's going to happen in the near future. Like we are pattern recognition creatures, right? We are pattern recognition human beings, and we can recognize a good pattern when we see one. And looking back at our history in our textbooks and our, if you want to look on YouTube or any source of where you get your, history, you'll notice a big pattern. And I notice that a lot of people say, and we say, history repeats itself. But who is the one that repeats it? The human, the individual. So really, is it the human that repeats it? Yeah. So then we say history does not repeat itself. It is the individual or the human that falls into a pattern that is then recorded. Because if history were to repeat itself, there truly would be no reason to be or being when stuff just keeps happening without our action or input. It is the action and input of the individual that creates that, purpose or meaning to the extent. And so it is that uncertainty of the future that creates that thrill, that drive, that seeking of being and being a person. So if history were to truly repeat itself, we could just look into the past in our historical analysis and see what will happen. But individuals do not know what will happen until it actually happens. And so we're left with that mystery. And so that mystery is unveiled through our historical analysis. But we are creatures of pattern. We fall into those patterns unknowingly. That is then recorded, which is where we get that history repeats itself. But it is us, the free individual, or the individual that just bees, that creates that such scheme. So I'm going to take a little second, take a drink of water, and then we'll get right back into it. Yes, Mom? Nothing? Okay. Yeah. Okay. 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 All right. Mhm. Okay, I'm in the middle of a meeting. That's okay. Are you ready? Ship that, put the shipping label? Okay. 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 All right. Sorry about that, y'all. I just had to pick up a very important phone call. But as we were talking about our historical analysis, our beings and freedoms, a nice halfway point to scoot on over into a newer idea, or I guess we're revisiting this idea. So we're talking about freedoms, philosophies, politics, historical analysis. We're going to go right back into striking. And I'm going to tie into how this helps with our freedoms and all of our such. So, striking, we talked about a couple weeks ago, is not just a singular action that someone does. It's not you picking up a picket fence or a line or a sign, going up to a corporation in front of their building, strike, strike, $5 raise, strike, strike, a better environment, strike, strike, stop using pesticides in our food, strike, strike. It is not an action that simply does. It's not something that we do. An action is a process that we do. More so, it's a process that is becoming. So, as Hegel will say, the individual exists in a process of becoming, not being. Because being itself is just, you are just here, being. I can describe you and articulate your existence and being. But becoming is a more appropriate word to use because the individual changes all the time. And it is that forever change that creates our material conditions because we project ourselves to reflect such change. So in our processes of becoming, we can akin that idea to the processes of striking. So when you strike for something, one particular thing. When you are striking, like when you are becoming, you strike for a particular reason. And the reason will always stay persistent within perception if that reason is present. So our reason for striking, of course, becoming in that process, to strike against the system, is to strike against capitalist thought, is to strike against the reason why we don't have a livable wage, is to strike against the reason why so many people starve when so few people own everything. That is the reason why we are striking or becoming. Right, the singular act of striking is a one-time thing, or maybe a course over a week, maybe a month, a couple months, even a year. If you are striking for the purpose and reason of to do it in a single action, then you are striking for, a temporary cause, or you're striking for a temporary solution. Of course, we're not here for temporary solutions. We're here for permanent solutions. And that permanent solution is understanding that in our, becoming and our striking, our permanence comes from our perception being developed. And so our strike for one reason is temporary. We will have to find another reason to strike, because we will just then be striking. Becoming in that strike helps the individual understand that a process is forever changing. So our striking methods and our striking processes will change. How we interact with individuals will change. How we perceive the world will change, because we live in a forever changing world. If we strike for a single reason, right, our reason may get lost in time. Our reason may not hold up against the tides of time. And so we will lose our motivation because, one, maybe the reason to strike isn't there anymore because the material conditions have changed. Maybe within our observations, the reason for striking isn't what it's made out to be when in praxis or when in practice. So, in the striking and the becoming of that striking, we understand that striking is a process. It is something that we do, yeah, but it is something that we interact with in consistency. Like, we strike for many reasons. We don't strike for one singular reason. We can boil down to a single reason, I'll say, like, against the system as a general term. But then we, of course, bring our specifics in: bourgeois society, capitalist living, private enterprise, private profits, and such as like that. So we understand our striking to be a process, and we understand our freedoms as well to undergo that becoming process. What makes a freedom? What makes a strike? What makes a philosophy? And what makes a politic? We have to understand where these things come from and how these things materialize in our perception and in our being and in our, in our material conditions. We have to understand where these processes birth from, basically come from, because then you better understand what you're observing in the moment. You're better understanding what you are perceiving as you are witnessing whatever it is you are witnessing and observing and seeing. So it is helpful to better understand where something comes from. And we talked about this last week, or it was the week before, the terms throw and forward. And so when we strike, we throw in the notion of why we are striking against the system. When we talk about freedoms, we're talking about freedom of speech. That is the idea of throw. Freedom of speech, of course, we have that freedom, right? Freedom of press and assembly and the right to bear arms, right? The right to vote and such. That was all thrown ideas. And our philosophies, right? What should be a freedom, what considered to be a freedom, all thrown. But we must understand the two terms, throw and forward, and the latter term, right, very important, understanding the forward nature of objects. So what is freedom truly? We have to understand where the philosophy of freedom comes from. And as we talked about, most of it comes from, minorly, from Greek philosophy, but then majority comes from the long 18th century, as it's called, the Enlightenment period, the European white thought. That is where most of our philosophical freedoms come from about 400 years ago. So we talk about freedom and philosophy in throw, but we rarely talk about these objects in forward. So striking, as just explained, striking in throw is just to strike. It's just to be there with the picket fence or with a sign saying strike, strike, $5 raise, strike, strike, be better for the environment. In forward, we understand striking to be a becoming process because we strike for multiple reasons. We strike to become, right, something that the system does not allow us to be. So that is why we're striking. So in the terms forward, throw, and forward, bringing back to historical analysis. So in throw and forward, our historical analysis starts with the objects in throw. I'm going to make it very, try and make it as simple as possible. In throw, right, whether you are on a phone, maybe you're watching through a computer screen, or however you are listening to me yapping right now, this is all in throw. You are experiencing the world every second new for the very first time, every single time, every single second. That is throw. You are presented with objects, I would say, very new in your perception. Because even though you may have your phone in hand that you have had for a while, maybe you are typing on a keyboard that has, been with you for a while. The screen that you've been looking at for these so many months, years, I guess, however many you've had your stuff. Throw is a unique condition that exists only in the perceptual moment. So when you are first presented with an idea, it's brand new, right? Like the idea of colonial settlerism, that's something that's brand new to some people. The idea of imperialism and capitalism and private thought, some of these are very new. What isn't new, though, right, is what we mistake to be a forwarded existence. Just because something has history doesn't mean it is are inherently forwarded within our perception. So you have this idea of freedom, right? You have this idea of, oh, then we'll go to talk about veterans as well. You talk about freedoms. Where do they come from? Freedoms. Who fought for them for you to have them? Freedoms. Where does it come from? Who gave them to you and whatnot? If you're an individual living in the imperial core, right? If you're an individual who lives in America, you within the education system has been pushed into this type of thinking and thought. Freedoms come from your veterans. Freedom comes from your war. Freedom comes from your fight and right to be and living in this free society. And I was really gross. I was like throwing up saying that, but it's true. Most individuals, and especially my cousin when I talked to him earlier, had this idea and notion that freedom is inherent. Freedom, well, you were just born with these freedoms and such. But what makes a freedom, right? And we could talk about freedom of, or the rights as well, but we talk about the freedoms of such what? Of anything, really, because what makes a freedom? We've been saying that all time past 45 minutes. But truly, what makes a freedom, right? Because that is the thrown understanding of what makes a freedom. It just is, right? It just is, and it just is what we have, right? Our freedom of speech, we just have that, right? It's within our perception and our ownership, you could say, as a free citizen of America, of this imperial core. So our freedoms come from something, and in the thrown understanding of our freedoms, it comes from the government. It comes from the state. It comes from being an American. It comes from that notion that freedom is American, or that freedom is just that being. And so when the individual just takes that for granted, right, appropriately, right, and appropriatively, within their young scheme of life as they were growing up in the education system, it is not to be questioned. Because when you do not question something and not to be questioned, it is a part of that scheme, it is a part of that being, and it is a part of that life that is lived. So the individual that inherently believes, right, throughout their entire life that businesses should exist because businesses are what runs the world's markets. And things like billionaires can and are allowed to exist, right? Um, Billionaires and their pollution and their yachts and their mansions and all of their material things that cost so many millions, that can all exist because those people have rights. And we must acknowledge, and of course, we must not hinder and impair those rights, because as a free American, we wouldn't want to do the same for ourselves. And so it all goes back to the I, a fundamental difference in value between the existences between two entities, you and I. And so that is where we get our bourgeois type of thinking. That is where we get our hyper individualism type of thinking, that 16th, 17th, 18th century philosophy of the white man. And so we go about our lives understanding these material conditions to what the individual understands what meaning to be. And that is whatever is thrown into the individual's scheme of life, how the individual perceives and bees, and whatever they try to make themselves to be, right? Whatever the individual happens to be, the individual will just happen to become. And it is the material conditions that which dictate or determine that becoming process. So when the individual is born in, let's say, lesser, impoverished conditions, the individual doesn't choose to become impoverished. The individual becomes impoverished because of such material conditions. Now, if those conditions were to change, then the individual, of course, would change. They would no longer become impoverished. They would become something else other than impoverished if their material conditions were to change. But same thing with the billionaire kid, or with a kid who was born a little more affluently. The individual just isn't born a billionaire. They become a billionaire, which is why you'll get so many different backgrounds from so many different income levels, right? All having the same mode of thought, right? Because it's the individual who perceives that also is created by that material conditions. So I'm reading the comments for a second. What is this? Oh, big facts. So, inherent rights. So, when I talk about rights and stuff, there exists inherent rights. When we talk about freedoms, there is no inherent freedom. But inherent rights and being, there exist inherent rights and beings, such as the rights to continue perception. And when I say continue perception, I just mean keep living, like water, food, shelter, safety, and all the things that constitute a comfortable living. Notice how I say comfortable, because you can exist and live, but in torturous states, but you still exist and live. That's not living, right? The individual has been stripped away of rights that constitutes a comfortable living, like imprisonment, like that. Those are conditions that um, go against the rights of the inherent, or those inherent rights of the individual. A comfortable living, right? Rights to edible food, rights to clean drinking water, rights to a shelter or a house that provides for the individual. So we're going to sidetrack for a second. Under Marxist Leninism, you have the authoritative government, which is all scary and bad and authoritative until you find out that the authoritative government is issuing free housing, it is issuing free food, and it is issuing the safety and comfort of the rights of all of their peoples, not just the citizens, but the people as well. Right. So, in a particular nation state, in that natural progression of revolutionizing from the proletariat class, you have control of the state, and it is the state in its authoritative state, right, its being, that creates such conditions. So in our right now, in our dictatorship of the bourgeois, you do not see such activities being used by our tax dollars in such ways, right? Our tax dollars provide for such beings. Private institution, private enterprise, yachts, mansions, and all these extremities that the individual rich have. That is the tax dollars, and that is all of our stuff being used in our current mode of production. And I'm going to rip into bourgeois society a little bit more now, because now I've got myself going. So, in a proletariat society and in a little socialist society, people think of an authoritative government. And I'm like, fuck yeah, it's authoritative government. Because imagine this: living in a bourgeois society, you have the choice of not having a house. You have the choice of voting, and you have the choice of going homeless, starving, and dying. That's a choice here in America, because you have the freedom of choice to do anything. This is a free society. This society is so free that you have the choice to do anything you want, because that is what Americans about: freedom. Now, if you choose to do something that is bad for society, we are a reactionary society in being. There is a police that exists to go and hunt you down after you have committed a crime, right? Because that was your choice. You committed a crime, now we go after you. So imagine this. I really want you to get into this thought, because I'm heating myself up. In a socialist society, or there's a communist society, you are forced, right, to have a house. Imagine that. You are forced to have it. In a bourgeois society, you can choose to have a house because there's a market rate and price for that house. There's a voluntary transaction that happens when people are acquiring and giving away and selling and purchasing and funding and finding a house. There exist processes at which stop the individual from getting a house or food or anything really. So imagine this. Social society, state-controlled government, state-owned means of production, worker-owned means of production. You're forced to have a house. You're forced to have food. You're forced to have clean drinking water. And you're forced to have your voice be heard among the community that which you lived in. Imagine that. Imagine a world but we don't have to imagine it, right? We can work towards these goals. We can work towards this reality. And that's what we're doing now. Helping the proletariat class become educated in understanding that it is labor that is our power, and it is labor that is keeping all of us in check, and all of us in our positions and places in society deemed worthy by the bourgeois class of society. We don't need to be taking none of this shit. But anyways, a little bit of a rampant, a little bit of a off basis there. But then so we go back into freedoms, polygonal stuff like that. Our material conditions are because of who? Because of us, the workers, the laborers. It's not the one single billionaire or the one single individual who owns a lot of capital, right? Just because they own it doesn't mean they actually labor our material conditions. Just because they own it doesn't mean they make all of this happen for us. Not one person's feeding millions of people, right? That's what happens at McDonald's. Not one person is feeding, going up to every single drive-through, every single cashier, register, every single cook, every single fryer, every pot of oil, dispensing every bag. to every single person. That is not how it works in our society. That one individual just simply owns that capital, the McDonald's capital, and reaps the benefit and reaps what he does not sow, right? He does not ring up any customers. That CEO or that person does not go up to any individual and ask them, how's your meal? That does not happen, because in this mode of production, it is the ownership of objects and that freedom to do so in that right that allows for that that notoriety. It allows for that, that social decorum, that standard to be set. Wow, that guy is successful because he owns things. And it is the white man's notion of appropriation that brings upon that idea. It is the appropriation of that notion that creates such a scheme of that notoriety. Wow, he owns a lot, so therefore he must be competent, so therefore he must be successful. And so we could talk about social classes and whatnot and such that which bring upon that reality. But we have to understand ownership and that freedom and that right to own that creates such a scheme. And there was a whole book written about how people consume and own stuff as a display of public affection or as a display of social standards. So when you consume, right, when you have stuff, consumption isn't just eating food, digesting and such. Consumption is having things as well. So like consuming can just be having a lot of water bottles, right, or having a lot of branded material like Supreme. That is consumption. When you buy Supreme or when you buy Hypebeast, when you buy expensive Gucci and stuff, material and gear, that is consumption, and you are displaying your consumption by your means of consumption. And so you have your consuming, which is a flaunt, which people recognize and see as you're consuming, right? You just spent $2,000 on a shirt. How ridiculous. It is not the fact that you spent, but it's also the fact that you own that $2,000 shirt. Because we recognize ownership as to be a very important standard in our society. That ownership of that object, that spending of, gives off that notoriety to the public, which is what's sought after, which is why people gravitate towards and quote unquote appreciate such behavior, because it is a signifier and a symbol of success. You have the means to spend that much all frivolously, which means you also have the means of supporting yourself. You have the means of not having to worry about your financials, which I would say is a big flex, right? If you have to worry about your financials. But you also have to understand where those financials come from. And any individual who has that much frivolous spending is going to be an exploiter themselves of the system, because they probably have a business. Or if they make a lot of money, they are themselves exploited, because you can't have a lot of money without their existence of exploitation, that robbing of surplus value, that robbing of labor during the production process, or that excess giving in production process. That flaunt gives that sense of notoriety. That flaunt, when you buy that $2,000 shirt, or when you buy that $50 million yacht, or when you buy that $100 million mansion, just goes to show that you have the means at which, and it's all natural too. This is where you get that this is a natural state of human being, right? What do you think when the caveman saw another caveman have all of this meat, these berries, have all of these means of keep sustaining living? That guy's the shit. That guy has a lot of stuff because he has he worked for all of that and such. And so we misconstrue that idea, especially this freedom and such and rights, to the ownership of objects as well. Because owning McDonald's is different from, hunting and killing 10 lamb for your family. That's completely different. But it's the notion, idea, the principle that makes it the same. So that freedom and right to own all of that nonsense, it's very important for the people living in this white nationalist society. It's very important to have that freedom and right to own such things. So I almost got lost track of time. We're almost at that hour. I totally could have went on for another hour and a half. But as we're wrapping this up, I'm just going to go back and from the beginning to now, wrap this up, answer some questions or whatnot. So we're going to go back all the way from the beginning. So what is a freedom? A freedom is something that someone has because of something else. And there's a lot of vagarity or vagueness to it, which is intentional. Because the freedom of speech comes from somewhere, right? The conditions of non-freedoms, the freedom of press and assembly and the right to bear arms and vote and all come from somewhere, and we have to understand where that comes from. Freedoms aren't inherent. Freedoms, right? Animals don't have freedoms. I always go back to animals. I have a cat. You think that cat understands what a freedom is? That cat goes wherever they want to go, and they will, because they means and appropriate their material conditions without having such notion or thought. There is no such thing as freedom for that guy. It just is. He's just being here. Now he understands boundaries, and boundaries are different from freedoms. But then we'll go on. Our philosophy and our politics, from our freedoms, of course, our notions, our philosophy dictates our politics, which is what dictates our freedoms. So our philosophies come from our freedoms. How you think and how you think the world should be, our philosophy, dictates that freedom. And of course, we wouldn't be able to understand how to dictate and how to determine stuff without our historical analysis. How did we come to build such a philosophy? We understand the past to make the present, to project into the future. And then so we talked a little bit about striking as well, how one becomes during a strike, using the analysis to strike, what the philosophy of striking, how that engages with our politics, and of course our freedom to strike. So we're at that 5 o'clock on the dot mark. I'm not going just yet, but thank you all so much for being here. And also people came in and out and whatnot, but thank you for being here. If you have any questions, I'll stay here for a little bit longer. But other than that, thank you for being here. We have more stuff to talk about next week. But anyways, thank you all. I appreciate all of you. And so if you have any questions, cool. If you need to go, please go. I'm not holding you hostage here. But of course, once again, for the millionth time, thank you so much. No problem. Thank you for joining us. It doesn't matter if you're late or not, because we're all here and we can always talk about what you missed if you want. But we're all part of this journey. And there is one thing I always say myself recently: the canons of teachings will always blend to the fabric of learning. So what does that mean? It's no matter where you start in your journey of life, you'll understand the entire blanket before you die. You'll understand why things the way they are before you come to meet your end and your demise. So even though you came in late, we're always late into the journey of life because there are already people here existing. And as I say in Thoreau, people are always here existing and being before you even are a sperm cell in your dad's balls, right? So when you are ejected from your dad's balls into your mother's vagina and then you become birthed, right? You had to have come from somewhere. So I'm late to life. I'm about, thousands of late when it comes to human history. So what is it to be 20 minutes late to a discussion, right? Because the canons of teaching, whatever is being taught, is going to blend into the fabric of learning. Whatever you're learning in life, you're going to find out what happened anyways. So the teachings of whatever anyone too, right? So just because I call it the canons of teaching doesn't mean someone else calls it any different. So when you learn from someone else or when you're discussing and engaging with someone else, understand that they too as well come from a particular perspective or notion. And so we celebrate, yeah, we celebrate our time being here, and we understand that our being here is what creates that meaning. Because there is no greater meaning than being. Any notion or any meaning created beyond the being is subjected to the individual perception. So there's a great philosophy that I'm building that dismantles white patriarchy and white colonialism and deconstructs that thought of appropriation versus appreciation, which is a little hint. Talking about that next week, because what I had planned for this week was appropriation and colonization versus appreciation and communization. That was a whole discussion. But after the conversation I had with my cousin, freedoms were more apparent to me this week. So if you don't want to miss that appropriation versus appreciation, come back next week. But of course, the canons of teaching, blah, 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 blending of the fabric of learning, blah, blah, blah. So you'll understand where we all come from, no matter who you learn it from, that the left thought and the anti-capital thought always comes from the same blanket, from the same fabric, the anti-establishment, the left-leaning thought, the anti-capital thought. So no matter if you get it from me, if you get it from someone on TikTok, or if you get it from somewhere, anyone else, you're always going to get the same scruff. You're always going to get the same stuff. You're always going to get the same down with the system, fuck the system, and we also must build community. That's pretty much the gist of what you're going to get everywhere else. So, of course, no, thank you for being here. Appreciate all of you. So I think I'll stay for another until 5:10. Then I'm gonna call it a hard quit. So if you have any questions, type in the chat or just speak and I'll talk. But of course, thanks again for everyone being here. So I'll shut up now.